Ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests, friends and colleagues, welcome to the RSE Gifford Seminar. I'm delighted to welcome our esteemed speaker, who is a Gifford lecturer at the University of Edinburgh, Professor Cornel West, and his two colleagues and friends, Professor Geoffrey Stout and Dr. David Kim. Before I go on to the format of the evening today, I just want to give you some housekeeping rules. We've been advised that there should be no fire alarm, but if there is a fire alarm, please assemble outside by the dome or through this door, and there will be RSE staff to help you out. This lecture and this evening is being live streamed, and it's also being filmed, and it's also being recorded for YouTube. So if any of you have any concerns, please let me know, or let one of the RSE staff know. The format of the evening will be that Professor West, who has already delivered 5 of his lectures, will give a brief overview of what he's been saying. He's basically got a minute per lecture to summarize. And then these two colleagues will each give 5 to 6 minutes of their own reflections, deliberations on his lectures and the theme, and then we will engage in a conversation, and then I will open it out to the audience. And this is, as I said, this is being live streamed as well, so there may be questions from the online audience as well. Before I introduce Professor West, let me just say something about the Gifford RSE Seminar. So the RSE and the University of Edinburgh unite annually to present the RSE Gifford Seminar, providing a unique overview of the Gifford Lectures series for the year, bearing in mind that this seminar is not just another lecture, but an interactive session where you can engage with the speaker on their series. The Gifford Lectures, for those of you who have not been able to attend or don't know, were established in 1885 under the will of Adam Lord Gifford, a judge of the Court of Session and a man of broad interests and compassion. The Gifford Lectures are held at each of the 4 ancient Scottish universities, and for over a century, the lectures have enabled an eminent field of scholars to advance philosophical, theological, and scientific thought. The Royal Society of Edinburgh, where you are seated just now, recognises, supports, and mobilises expertise from across academia, business, and public service for the benefit of Scotland and the wider world. Our fellows, who are all elected from academia, business, and public service, are what we consider the most distinguished in their fields. I should have also, first of all, introduced myself, which I always forget to do. I'm Mona Siddiqui, and I'm a professor in the School of Divinity at the University of Edinburgh. And thank you. And for the purpose of this seminar, I'm also VP International at the Royal Society of Edinburgh, which is just another very posh way of saying that I try to initiate international collaboration with other academies around the world. It's a great role and a very honored role. So let me say something about Professor West. In his debut, he said that these lectures, and you can see the title, Jazz-Soaked Philosophy for Our Catastrophic Times from Socrates to Coltrane, that these lectures reflect my passionate conviction that the vocation of philosophy may be, in the language of the great jazz musician John Coltrane, a force for good in a broken world. How do we emerge from the bleakness of our catastrophic times? At this year's RSE Gifford Seminar, Professor West, who is a distinguished American philosopher, theologian, activist, and public intellectual, considered the philosophical and artistic resources at our disposal to help us shape courageous, compassionate responses and find ways of moving forward. The seminar allows audience members to explore with Professor West some of the larger questions, some of the challenges that he has provoked from his lectures. Let me introduce very briefly the two colleagues. Professor Geoffrey Stout on the far right, Professor Emeritus of Religion, Department of Religion at the University of Princeton. He's Professor Emeritus of Religion, he's a member of the Department of Religion and is associated with the Departments of Philosophy and Politics, the Center for the Study of Religion, and the Center for Human Values. His work focuses on the possibility of ethical discourse in a religiously pluralistic society. He has also served as president of the American Academy of Religion in 2007. On my immediate right, Professor David Kim, who was actually just recently flown over from Hawaii. So he has come a long way change climates, but he says everybody dresses the same, apparently. He's a visiting scholar, Barclay Center for the Study of Religion, University of California. Professor Kim is founder of Radical Love Productions, a media and consultancy company. For nearly 20 years, Dr. Kim was professor of religious studies and American studies at Connecticut College, where he founded a center on race and ethnicity. Most recently, he served as executive director of the Center of Comparative Studies in Race and Ethnicity at Stanford University. There's so much more I can say about my colleagues, but I think you can Google them. I think what we're really interested is in the conversation that they're going to have. I'm going to pass over to Dr. West, but before I do, I just want to put something to him. I'm just taking this liberty as chair. I was reading G.K. Chesterton, and he said that, I'm going to ask him, was he right when he wrote that the problem with the modern world is not that it is evil, but that it's far too good? The real danger facing society that has cast off its religious moorings, he says, is not just that the vices are let loose, but that the virtues, cut off from the ultimate principle to which they should be oriented, become distorted and destructive in their own right. The modern world, he said, is full of the old Christian virtues gone mad. Anyway, I will leave you with that thought before you commence. Professor West, please take the floor. You can stay seated here, or you can go to the podium.
But it's a wonderful thing to have such profound respect for Gilbert Keith Chesterton and still see that he's wrong about a number of things. And we'll say more about that, even though the challenge is a fascinating one. I want to begin by saluting my dear sister, Mona, who's played such a fundamental role. She and Jay have been the two persons who are actually responsible in so many ways of nominating me and pushing me forward, and the committee being kind enough to bring me here and embrace me. And my beloved wife, Anahita, herself quite a poet and a professor. And I have been treated with unbelievable graciousness, and we deeply, deeply appreciate that. To sit here with my dear brother, Jeff Stout, who I met for 51 years ago. He presented the Gifford Lectures 7 years ago.
How's it going so far?
It's been magnificent. But he delivered the Gifford Lectures 7 years ago and dedicated the Gifford Lectures to myself and a friend who died, and I dedicated my Gifford Lectures to him and my beloved wife. That's the kind of very deep friendship and brotherhood that we have that's worth acknowledging, because it's real. My dear brother David Kim, I met 31 years ago. He was then my head teaching assistant. He's gone on to have quite an illustrious career. So you can imagine the kind of homecoming that this is. And then when I look and see my roommate, Robert Gerard, this is his birthday. He's 72 years young, happy birthday. He's sitting right next to Brother Fred, who was in our class at Harvard in 1974. We both have such deep love and respect for. And then, of course, is the one and only Melinda, the wife of Robert Gerard. And I'm beginning with this note of piety, because piety has been one of the drum beats in my lecture. What does it really mean to muster the courage to have a virtuous acknowledgement of the sources of good in one's life from womb to tomb? Piety and all the various uses that it has. I'll be very, very brief, because I must be very honest and candid that there's a sense in which my Gifford Lectures were deeply motivated by a golden moment in the Gifford Lectures given by the first American in Edinburgh. Josiah Royce had given it in Aberdeen, but in Edinburgh he was the inimitable and adorable William James. Nobody like him in the history of American letters. In that moment, he says that at the core of the religious problem, at the center of the human condition, is the call for help. The call for help. And I think the motto of this institution, knowledge made useful. It's a choice, knowledge made useful. The second grandest comic novel ever written in the history of American letters was written by a young man who died at 39 years old, but his name was Nathaniel West, no relation. His real name was Nathan Weinstein, but he changed his name in order to get into Brown University. which was part of the scandal that haunted him for the rest of his life. But he happened to be also a literary genius. And it was called Miss Lonely Hearts. And he said, I'm going to rewrite William James's Gifford lectures along with Dostoevsky's Brothers Karamazov in a comic strip. And he wrote 91 pages of some of the most powerful but grimmest and dimmest pages responding to that question that William James raised right here in Edinburgh in 1900, the call for help. It was nihilistic. We talked about nihilism in relation to The Iceman Cometh, Eugene O'Neill's 1939 play. And the response was, there's no help. There's no hope. There's no way out. There's no sense of possibility. That we somehow just limp by with our Hobbesian-like egoistic sensibilities and with our sense of doom. And so when I talk about jazz soaked, I'm talking about blues, catastrophic, artistically transfigured, honestly confronted, and wrestled with. We're talking about swing, trying to find different conceptions of time that allow us to believe at least there's some possibility and potentiality given the grimness and the dimness, not just of our present day moment. We can think about Gaza and other places, but in the history of the species as a whole. Not just in terms of our individual situations, but our collective destinies as a species. And in that sense, our destiny is inextricably interwoven with all of those the great Frantz Fanon called the wretched of the earth. Moral sensibility, political concern, solidarity. Yes, Gifford, in his grand vision, was concerned about bringing voices to wrestle with that. Last but not least, improvisation. Phronesis, practical wisdom. How do we have the right timing to read the right context, to make the right kinds of visions, the right kinds of efforts, and also, most importantly, the right kind of manifestations of a love supreme. And the love supreme of Coltrane is rooted in not just love of neighbor, but love of truth and love of wisdom, beauty, and love of goodness. And for some of us, still tied to deep, rich religious traditions, love of God. And even for a few of us, a love of a Palestinian Jew named Jesus. That's in part what I've been blessed to talk about here in this beloved city of Edinburgh, in this august institution called University of Edinburgh.
You are my favorite speaker. You stuck to time.
Did I
Thank
say
you.
that?
Yes, I didn't have to say anything.
Oh, I was trying the best of my ability, absolutely.
Professor Stout, please.
What amazingly learned and inspiring lectures these have been. Professor West reminds us in these lectures that our civilization is as flawed and mortal as the human beings who created and inhabited. Flawed in respects that make all of us agents as well as victims of catastrophic harm. Mortal in the sense of heading toward collapse, like democratic Athens, Republican Rome, and every other hegemon before it. The word catastrophe comes from Greek. St. Paul warned Timothy that a community's verbal wrangling can result in catastrophe. St. Peter warned that the ungodly are destined for catastrophe. In the Eumenides, Aeschylus had the chorus warn that the Furies will inflict catastrophe on Athens if Orestes goes unpunished. His fall in that play is softened by means of ritual cleansing and a supposedly new invention, trial by jury, which is Athena's remedy for revenge. The play's concluding chant affirms her pacification of the Furies and the hero's release, as if civic concord and Athenian glory might last forever. Half a century later, Euripides did something quite different with the same myth. The envy, rage, and credulity that had been signs of past or preventable catastrophe were now held responsible for the old order's collapse, its actual demise. Neither Athenian arrangements nor the Homeric gods prevented the collapse from occurring. Euripides sought to make this transition intelligible without simply canceling his predecessors or giving either presumption or despair the last word. It's a remarkable artistic accomplishment. Now, a similar trajectory can be found in Latin poetry. Virgil's Aeneid celebrated the new emperor's divine descent and destiny, while warning him in the poem's stunning conclusion of the potential for destruction he held in his hands. Now, just a few decades later, Seneca's tragedies depicted rulers gone thoroughly mad and whole realms in collapse, whereas his essays and letters taught that true freedom and happiness can be found only by retreating into oneself. Where else could he look if his tragedies were right about his circumstances? Erasmus, who edited those essays, and Montaigne, who cited them repeatedly, admired Seneca's stoicism, in particular his account of good and evil. He had done his best, Seneca had, as Nero's tutor and courtier, they thought. But when the tyrant, when Nero sentenced Seneca and his entire family to death, stoical detachment was the best response he, as a Socratic pagan, could muster. Erasmus and Montaigne felt that the divine gift of Christian faith, as interpreted by their own church, had transfigured such pagan virtue into loving blessedness. Not that Cornel accepts either their Stoic account of good and evil, which I think he regards as inadequate to catastrophe, or their deference to ecclesial authority. I'd like to hear more about both of those things. But what about Eliot? He depicted a massive cultural collapse while striving to transfigure it poetically, as Euripides had done. Seneca's tragedies figured heavily in two essays that Eliot wrote in his conversion year of 1927. After The Hollow Men, in which the world ends with a whimper, but before the dark, dark, dark of the four quartets is interrupted by the promise that all shall be well. Then we have O'Neill. The Iceman cometh, takes us into hell, and leaves us there. No stoical escape within, no existential leap of faith beyond, no divine interruption from above, no achievable tomorrows to wish for as a collectivity. Eliot's picture would be just as dire as that if monarchy and Anglo-Catholicism weren't given the same sort of pass that O'Neill had already unmasked as vitiated nostalgia. But Cornel isn't recommending those. And Eliot's defense of them makes modernity seem so vacuous as to be unworthy of transfiguration. Are shafts of lightning from above, then, the only illumination to be had? Moments of interruption in a seemingly endless night? Euripides, Shakespeare, Chekhov, Woolf, and Morrison didn't think so. Their visions are brighter than Eliot's, O'Neill's, and Seneca's without being less dark. That sounds impossible. And yet, here's an example from Beloved with which I'll conclude. When Paul D tells Sethe that they need some kind of tomorrow, he is yearning for a life more satisfying and sustainable than a momentary cessation of terror. A life they might stitch together, share, and pass on. He should yearn for such a life. Is he entitled to hope for it? If so, on what grounds? And how might such hope be realized? He finds himself gazing at a quilt. This is at the end of the book. A quilt made of brightly hued patches, like the ones the narrator had contrasted with scraps in the full range of dark earlier in the novel. The brighter patches are always there, catastrophe or not, in the very fabric of our world, awaiting transfiguration. That's what I think the novel tells us. If they weren't there, neither the novel's horrors nor its concluding note of hope would make sense. Sethe, Paul realizes, has recognized his blessedness, befriended his mind, been tender with his wounds. She has gathered his pieces, put them in right order, like a quilter. He responds by placing his story next to hers and taking his fingers, her fingers in his. For that is how communities capable of desirable tomorrows and worthy of transfiguration are made, from remnants by multiple hands joining. Is it not so? Thank you.
Thank you so much. Let me turn to Professor Kim.
Thank you. And I want to say thank you and good evening to everyone here, and thank you for the invitation to participate. When I was thinking about responding to Cornel's incredible, magnificent lectures, I only had one word, which was amen. There's a kind of comprehensiveness and completeness to him, and sometimes it's hard to find a fissure that you might have disagreement, because I have learned so much from him. He's my teacher and my mentor, and I've learned so much from Jeff Stout as well. I guess the note I want to start, I guess I want to make a turn in our conversation to the jazz itself. To the jazz that is soaking philosophy, and the kind of rehabilitation and the reimagining of philosophy that really is the entirety of Cornel's Gifford lectures. And I think the note about James and the note about Nathaniel West, that call for help, is a good reminder about how we should reimagine philosophy, to ask the question, is philosophy serving the wretched of the earth? Is philosophy serving those who are issuing that call for help? And I think the retelling you do of philosophy as jazz soaked is saying it hasn't quite. And the kind of choices between, say, philosophy and poetry, or reason and jazz, maybe false choices, because again, it is this question like who are we seeking to serve? And I think the note about piety, really hits at the heart of it. To whom do our hearts belong? As we engage in the modalities of thinking about paideia and phronesis and parrhesia, that the move I guess I would make from to jazz away from piety is to something like fidelity. Where you want a kind of a sound and oral sense of where one's heart is, because fidelity to me and piety is really about love. Who are our obligations to, and that where are our motivations such that they're grounded in love for those who have been unjustifiedly hurt. The catastrophes of the empires, the catastrophes not just of modernity but of history. I was thinking about the Greek roots of catastrophe as well. Catastrophe, which is a downward turning. And when history and society is turned down and they crush people, the question becomes, what do we do to those who survive, maybe not in body but in spirit? And I think the kind of polyphony that you've been talking about, the kind of inheritances that we have from those who have not survived maybe in body but in spirit, speaks to like how we should be thinking about what are the obligations of philosophy. Fidelity, and I think the idea that fidelity is a kind of trueness, a kind of, a trueness of spirit. I think we often don't know if we're being true to ourselves. And I think your admission, are we listening to ourselves, where the ourselves is not just our individuality, but it is this massive inheritance of voices and peoples that are often not just our own people. So I think, the philosophical traditions that you're talking about are not just the Western canon, for example. And you and I, you've taught me this, that the inheritances of, say, the Black freedom tradition are not just for Black people, but they're for everybody. And so if we inherit something like Black freedom and Black love, and that becomes the root source of our fidelity, what does it look like? What does philosophy look like? And what does paideia look like, where it is a commitment to the elevation of our humanity, a kind of fortification for those whose humanity has been denied. And that really is our work, right? I was struck in listening to your lectures how much you presented yourself as a teacher, and the embodiment of paideia, so that, you're teaching us to invite ourselves to be true, this kind of fidelity to, again, the wretched of the earth, those who suffer. And that, again, is, the catastrophe that comes down on those folks might insist on a downbeat that's the 1 and the 3. But I think the jazz soaked is the 2 and the 4. It's the 2 and the 4. That the blues and the swing and the improvisation. It's insisting on the backbeat of history, the backbeat of experience, the backbeat of humanity. And that changes philosophy. That changes the call, the service of philosophy. So that's what I want you to answer.
Very much. I'm so impressed everyone is sticking to time. Thank you very much for that. Very thoughtful words. I'm going to ask you, Dr. West, first of all, if you have any reflections on anything you've heard from your colleagues, friends.
I just want to thank my dear brothers. They took the assignment very seriously. There's no doubt about that. It provided a substantive response, and we could go on for seminar after seminar wrestling with these very rich readings. I would probably want to put in just a very quick defense of Thomas Stearns Eliot, very quick one, because Jeff's reading is really compelling in so many ways. But I'm thinking of both the Rose Garden and the Lotus in the first poem, Burnt Norton. And it's actually rooted in something very, very concrete that was invoked at the very end of your powerful remarks. Because you remember, that's a kairos moment, and it's so quick in the poem. Because it's dry, the pool is empty, all of a sudden there's a kairos moment of meaning, and it's gone. Well, Lyndell Gordon tells us that there actually was a moment in a pool that was dry, with a magnificent woman named Emily Hale, who provided a way of sustaining Thomas Stearns Eliot, given his wrestling with the legacy of his divorce of Sister Vivian. Emily Hale herself was a distinguished professor at Smith College, and they wrote letters to each other, at least 3 or 4 every week. 95% of those letters have been destroyed. So all we can do is generate hypothesis of how it was that this powerful poet and literary genius, but also, as you can imagine, a man, a human, with tremendous faults and foibles and scars and bruises, and has these moments of touch that sustain him. And it's that touch with Emily as a human being and a wonderful woman is a very kind of different affair than carrying around Dante in the back of his pocket, the Italian version, everywhere he goes. So he's got an I-thou relation with both, but different dynamics taking place. And the dynamics with Sister Emily Hale, invisible, hidden, concealed, and we don't even know to this day he died in 65. We don't even know, because the letters have been destroyed. So that in a way it's a confirmation of the powerful reading in some sense, when we actually get a whole sense of a jazz-soaked T.S. Eliot, all the way down, in time, in history, in body, and always already shaped by antecedent fragments of traditions, with an S, that shape him. And of course, I'm suggesting that's true for all of us too. That's true for each and every one of us in terms of our very, very human stories that allow us to be here based on the reading that you provide, with that moment at the end of Toni Morrison's classic. And when we actually look then at the music itself that Brother Dave is talking about here, you might recall that when Duke Ellington said black people have made dissonance a way of life, so that the blue note itself is a note of not just dignity. You got to have dignity in your sound. That's one of the big differences between John Coltrane and Kenny G. I love Kenny G for background music. Coltrane, there's a gravitas and a dignity in that sound that he's honing out of his own wrestling with the darkness of his soul. And it's not a function of his blackness or skin pigmentation, because there's a whole lot of black folk blowing the horn who sound worse than Kenny G. It's a human choice that they're making at the level of wrestling with their own complicated, contradictory, incongruent humanity in that way. And yet there is this tradition of these great figures, a tradition grounded on genres created by black people, who choose moral, spiritual, artistic greatness that then are open to the world. And you get these magnificent vanilla brothers and sisters and others who become part of that tradition. In the same way with Plato or Aristotle or Euripides, here comes August Wilson, Lorraine Hansberry, and the others as part of this deeply Western tradition as black participants. It is mutual, it is reciprocal, it gazes across time, across cultures, across nations, that tries to keep track of our very complicated, wretched, and wonderful humanity.
Do you want to come back to anything?
Jeff, do you want?
I'm not saying that the Kairos moments aren't there in Eliot's life.
Well, in the text too.
They appear in the text.
Right,
The question
right.
is whether the poetry succeeds in transfiguring what goods he finds in the fallen world. And I go to other sources to find that more successfully pulled off. Actually, I find The Rock the most promising Eliot with regard to this point. So he says, I will show you the things that are now being done and some of the things that were long ago done, that you may take heart. Make perfect your will. Let me show you the work of the humble. Listen. And all that was good you must fight to keep with hearts as devoted as those of your fathers who fought to gain it. Our citizenship is in heaven, yes, but that is the model and type for your citizenship upon earth. Now that is a promissory note that I find myself yearning to find fulfilled in the rest of the poetry, including in The Rock. But it's in The Rock where I think he gets closest because of the way he's talking in concrete terms about working people.
Yes, yes, yes.
That's that's where he comes closest. But much of the time, he slips into a nostalgia where the good is always past, and the present is so thoroughly fallen that it's hard to see how he's actually transfiguring it poetically. That's what I find successful in Euripides and not successful.
Yeah, no, that's fair.
And successful in Morrison.
And Toni Morrison. Yes, yes, yes.
Now, that's not to say, just one brief, that's not to say that we need every significant artist to do everything for us.
Right, right, right.
So we need Richard Wright, and we need Baldwin's and Ellison's responses to Richard Wright, both of whom said to him, in effect, you have described a world so fallen that you, the writer, Richard Wright, couldn't exist in it. You haven't made sense of yourself. They were right about that. But we need to be taken into that hell by Richard Wright, and we need Ellison to help us get out.
Well, ask David if he wants to say anything before I open it
Sure,
up to the
sure.
audience.
I guess I wanted to touch on Weber just quickly, because you did touch on him a few times. And you talked about the vocation lectures regarding the disenchantment of the world, which more literally is translated as a demagification of the world. And I think one of the responses about the call in the wake of the demagification of the world is, can there be enchantment anymore? And I think the ways in which you soak philosophy with jazz is an attempt to find some magic in the midst of despair, in the midst of a kind of hopelessness. I was thinking about the analogy to someone like Howard Thurman, where Thurman talks about the growing edge as a kind of sign of hope in the face of despair. It's not just despair, which also give some glimpses to Gadamer as well. This kind of fusion of horizons. So does something like jazz, the kind of responsiveness, the blues, the swing, the improvisation, give us glimpses of that growing edge, rather than the bleakness that we're left with Eliot, for example, or the bleakness of O'Neill. That the kind of hopefulness of the jazz-soaked life may be some part of us that we need to be revived.
Yeah, this is so rich, though. I mean, part of the challenge here is trying to understand first what we mean by demagification or disenchantment, and what the object of criticism is. It reminds me at the very end of A Dollhouse, you remember, where Algemar, it's already shown himself to fall on his face. And she said, I was looking for a miracle. What the miracle is looking for is not the kind of miracle David Hume was talking about in his essay on miracles. The miracle was to open himself in such a way that he would be vulnerable such that some genuine love could take place and he wouldn't simply be playing the role and function of a bourgeois husband. So the miracle in that sense is so infused in the mundane. It's infused in the quotidian. It's infused in everyday life. It's Emersonian, Ellisonian, jazz-like. You see, jazz is like Chekhov. Jazz is concerned with the steady ache of misery in one's everyday life. And then it's got the Keatsian question. You remember John Keats says the fundamental question of life is what? Energy or despair? What kind of energy you gonna mobilize? What kind of vitality and vibrancy are you gonna have access to? Can you swing your life in such a way that you don't deny the catastrophe, but the catastrophe does not suffocate all of your vibrancy and vitality and energy? You see, part of my challenge to Weber here, and of course we got social studies at Harvard in the 1970s, where they read Weber so much that Talcott Parsons was turning flips in his lectures after about the 7th lecture, right? Because it was all about Weber and Durkheim. But it was about conceptions of disenchantment where various structures of religious narratives had been secularized and radically called into question. But if you look for the magic in everyday life, that's a shift. Something else is going on. And it won't necessarily take the form of what we understood miracles to be in earlier times, but looking for the miraculous and looking for the magical. That's why I'm a little suspicious of re-enchantment. You see, I'm very suspicious of what Oscar Wilde called that one coin in which one side is sentimentality and the other side is cynicism. Mm-hmm. You got to push that coin aside. That's right. You see. And America is a deeply sentimental place too often about itself. And so once your expectations are shattered, often the only option is cynicism. That was part of my critique of Eugene O'Neill. That's part of my critique, Nathaniel West. If you're going to be sentimental and cheaply romantic, cynicism is waiting for you. That's right. If you're going to go with the blues, then optimism and pessimism are not part of the categories you use about the world. You're a prisoner of hope. That's something else. That's something very different. You're holding on for dear life. So I hear what you're saying there about, and the vocation lectures are still marvelous. That's why I used them at the very beginning, because they still speak so deeply in a variety of different ways. But for those of us who have deep democratic sensibilities, not just politically, but existentially, in terms of everyday life of everyday people, to use Sly Stone's language here, the dignity of everyday people, or ordinary people in the language of James Cleveland. There's something about that quotidian, mundane quality of our lives where we can still tease out certain kind of nobility, which is spiritual and moral, as opposed to simply monarchical or political. economic.
Thank you very much. I'm going to open it out to the audience. We do have 2 roving mics, so if you could raise your hand. The gentleman at the back first.
Thank you so much to all the speakers, particularly Dr. West. It's good to see you on this side of the pond. I must admit, I'm a historical materialist, and I think one of the greatest things that Marx says was that the job of the philosophers is not just to analyze the world, but to change it. And I take that and I run it through Frederick Douglass, who said, without struggle, there will be no progress. And we can see that in the work of John Coltrane, in the work of Charles Mingus, for example, Fables of Faubus. We can see it in Nina Simone's Mississippi Goddam, where artists, with tapping into the collective, are able to motivate people and solidify perspective, which is about realizing the miracle, where the miracle is recognizing our part in the collective and the collective struggle for change, struggle to realize the potential for peace, justice, humanity. And that only comes through action. As Stokely Carmichael said, you're either a part of the problem or you're a part of the solution. So I have a deep love for philosophy, but my value in philosophy is that it is a deep way to mobilize that recognition of the collectivity and to put it into action to realize our potential as human beings, rather than letting that go past in the interest of profit or militarism or whatever it is that distracts from our potential. So I'd like to hear from each of the speakers, if you would, how you see the philosophy as an agent for change in collectivity in the pursuit of peace and justice.
No, beautifully put. Beautifully put.
Who wants to go first?
Should I just?
No,
I just so deeply resonate with your eloquence, though, brother. But I want to push you on this issue. We go back to Marx's dissertation, the difference between Democritean and Epicurean conceptions of materialism, right? That in that dissertation he wrote at Bonn, he was concerned about a quest for truth. It's not just a tool to be used and mobilized. When he comes to the end of the thesis on Feuerbach and says exactly what he says, he's not saying what Sorel will say, which is you can lie to the people and use it as a tool and mobilize it for social change. No, that's not Karl Marx. He's too Hegelian for that. He's too German in the best sense. Every country, every project's got the worst sense, right? No, he really believes that. He's making truth claims so that we don't want to reduce it just down to instrumentalism. Because that very instrumentalism is part and parcel of the thoroughly commodified world of a market-driven conception of the world that we use anything in order to generate an unjust end, which is short-term profits by any means with no moral considerations. No, that's not Karl Marx. You see what I mean? And I'm going back to my dissertation, The Ethical Dimensions of Marxist Thought. As you probably know, I wrote that almost 50 years ago, but I have some remembrance of what was going on in that text. So I very much agree with you. It's just that I don't want to lose the truth telling, because the truth telling is also being self-critical. And Marx is always growing. He's reading. You haven't read Vico. You haven't read Darwin. He dedicates the Capital of Darwin. You haven't read so-and-so. Frederick Engels. Have you read Balzac? I don't have time for Balzac. I'm reading the 3rd volume. Have you read Shelley? You know, he has that paideia that's still very much a part of what he is. And in some ways, you know, that's the best of Europe. We can talk about European crimes all night and all day, but the best are those who are involved in the quest for truth and doing precisely what you're talking about. Using it as part and parcel of trying to make sure poor and working people are treated with dignity, given the structures of predatory capitalism, structures of white supremacy, structures of imperial tentacles of empires, and so forth and so on. Patriarchy, we can go on and on. But I appreciate that, though. But you all might want to just jump in on that.
Do either of you want to say anything?
Well, I would just add, I agree with all of this. I would add that part of what Cornel's Gifford lectures and mine 7 years ago, both of which are influenced by
Each other.
in each other, but also pragmatist tradition in terms of and the parts of pragmatism that rhyme with the theses on Feuerbach. We were both elevating values, the significance of values that resist cost-benefit analysis. So part of the point of starting with catastrophe is that catastrophe and horrendous evil are conceptually the flip side of sacred value. Sacred value being that which is worthy of reverence. And by virtue of being worthy of reverence, reverent celebration, relevant protection, right? By virtue of being worthy of reverence, it is not subject to easy comparisons of the sort that commodified language demand. So the forms of reasoning that are so prominent in our academic culture and in our bureaucratic culture are forms of instrumentalized reason on the one, instrumental reason on the one hand, and forms of mere rights judgments on the other. And neither of these forms of discourse, both of which Weber is an excellent theorist on, neither of them adequately captures the respects in which ordinary people and freedom movements that keep recurring throughout the modern period are concerned with sacred value, with catastrophe as a mark of the destruction or violation of sacred value that must be resisted so that the relevant protections can be put in place and the relevant celebrations can be held. Without that, the relevant forms of action themselves reinforce the logic of the commodified, bureaucratized culture.
And let's just add a quick footnote. Do you want to jump in, Brother Dave, on this? Because, I mean, that's important. Brother Jeff is talking about sacred values as opposed to talking about sacred beings. You see. So when we think about freedom, you think about dignity of working people, well, that is a kind of sacred value in the sense that that's the very thing that one is pursuing. I think one of the best treatments of this is by Sidney Hook, Marxist at the time, wrote a dissertation in 1927 called The Metaphysics of Pragmatism and the Status of Instrumentalism. And he talks about market-driven forms of instrumentalism and what he understands as Marxist, which is tied to some kind of values that are presupposed by Marx that are critical of commodification gone mad, structures of domination, asymmetric relations of power at the workplace, and so forth. And he begins with a close reading of frontispiece in his dissertation of William Blake. Because William Blake, as poet, going back to what I've been talking about, poetry and philosophy, he was wrestling with these different forms of the status of instruments given the fog soaked, market-driven London that so deeply, deeply upset him as one who was deeply spiritual without in any way being tied to religious institutions, deeply moral with sacred values.
I mean, I'll just say that I'm actually not hesitant to speak of individual human beings as having sacred value, the Grand Canyon as having, the Isle of Skye having sacred value. These, and why do I say that? Because these are things such that their violation or destruction would be horrendous, not merely bad, horrendous. and they deserve reverent protection and celebration. Okay? So it's not just freedom in the that.
Oh, right.
It's not. It's not just.
I was just relating
Yeah.
to our historical materialist brother.
Yeah.
No, but you're absolutely right. There's other context. That's right. That's right.
Well, no, listen, I agree with that. That it depends on what you mean by philosophy, right? And the philosophy that serves, so the sacred beings and sacred values may be those, again, the wretched of the earth, so that we hold them in reverence as a kind of principle, against which we philosophize. I agree with Jeff, absolutely. Like, it's not just an abstract idea of freedom, but what do we learn from philosophy? What do we learn from philosophies that help us learn more deeply about context and complexity? Because I think that's where we're not trying to be abstract from the world, but we want to be thoroughly enmeshed in the world, thoroughly worlded, as it were.
Yes, so, Shadab, did you have a question? Yeah, so the gentleman in the middle there, and then, sorry, there's an arm here, and I don't know whether it's, yeah, you go ahead first.
Should I go ahead? Mm-hmm. Professor West, I really enjoyed listening to your lectures, and I've been listening to them with a particular ear, with the ear of a liberation theologian from the Islamic tradition. So that's the grammar with which I've listened to your music. And when I hear a jazz-soaked philosophy, in terms of the grammar of liberation theology, I'm thinking of a preferential option for the oppressed. Would it be fair to translate a jazz-soaked philosophy as a philosophy that is committed to the wretched of the earth, to the oppressed, or would you push back against that? Would you find that to be a reductive representation? So for instance, I find that there is a powerful affect to your descriptor that is lacking in the existing language, which is still Latin in an intellectual lexicon, right? There's something that speaks to the heart when we talk about soaking that isn't quite there when we speak about preferential options. So I'm just curious if you'd be happy with that translation, or is there something lost in translation?
Wonderful question. Wonderful question. I think it's very important, though, brother. Anytime you use categories that characterize traditions and communities, that you don't reduce the rich heterogeneity to something homogeneous, or you don't reduce your particular interpretation of the tradition as somehow, having a monopoly of what the tradition really is. You see, there's a whole host of different jazz musicians who are reactionary in politics. Just like you got left-wing followers of T.S. Eliot, like the great F.O. Matheson of Harvard, who master of Eliot House and committed suicide. We talked about him, but he wrote one of the finest books on Eliot, remained very much a disciple of Eliot as a Christian socialist, very, very tied to struggles of working peoples, and resisted the Cold War hysteria, had his critique of the Soviet Union, but was willing to work with communists like, or hidden communists like Paul Robeson and W.B. Du Bois and others. He would remain tied to their efforts to fight against white supremacy and Jim Crow and what have you. And so it is with jazz. So I have a particular reading of jazz that always opens up the realities of various other appropriations of jazz, ideologically, politically, artistically, and so on. And that's true internally for any tradition. When Louis Armstrong says Charlie Parker's playing music he doesn't understand and like, I won't use the term, which is not a nice term. And Louis Armstrong is the greatest genius of all geniuses, but he's wrong as two left shoes about Charlie Parker. You see what I mean? He has no monopoly on what jazz is, just because he's the great revolutionary artist who helped create it with Bolden and Morton and others. And the same was true when people say, oh, well, free jazz is not jazz. Well, if you say you don't like it, just say you don't understand it. What makes you think jazz has to have meters? Maybe you can have non-meters. I'm not going to pay. Don't pay. Somebody else will. Maybe that's a way for jazz to develop. Maybe that's a way for jazz to decay. We don't know. A jazz-like sensibility for me is allowing all of these voices to be heard, which is the anthem of black folk anyway. Lift every voice. It's not just my voice and my friend's voice. Lift them all. Let's see. Try it out. See who's tried and true. See which ones speak. See which ones endure, and so forth and so on. So in that sense, just like in theology, right, with James Cone or Beverly Harrison and so many others, Malcolm X's liberation theological interpretation of prophetic Islam and what have you, right? Let it flow, let it flower, let it flourish. Let's see. Then you got an indictment of the Islamic practices in Iran. Where's the fundamental commitment to woman life freedom? Sounds like critiques of Christianity when you're trying to subordinate working people and women and so forth. Absolutely. Then you've got these magnificent Muslim freedom fighters. Yes, indeed. Same tradition, one highly prophetic, the other deeply priestly, too well adjusted to various structures of domination. I think that's true for any tradition, be it jazz, be it Judaism, be it Buddhism, be it Islam, and so forth and so on.
Thank you. There's a question. Yes, gentleman there.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I've got a question. Okay, so I've heard what you three had said, and it was amazing that hearing what you're saying about the what's the word? I've forgotten the word now. The catastrophic, what you were saying about jazz and the music and everything that you come up with. I think I've come up with another one, if that's all right, about life. Life is about being person-centered. Life is about amazing people who have different lives in the world of what they say in America, in the UK, life in all different ways in different countries. Life is about everything that I just think life can be peaceful, can be absolutely brilliant in what they do. Life is about being the person, being the center of every single theory that everybody has and have. And, well, I suppose I could just say authentic. He's absolutely dead right as well by saying that. And life is about the singer, if I can add into that mix. Basically one life from Bob Marley. I think the general speak of what he's trying to portray as one life is the song of one life, as in the life of and the love, yes. About.
Do you have a question for Dr. West?
About everything. Sorry.
About everything.
So based on that theory I've just come up with, my question is, what do you think of the life thing that I've just come up with, as well as what you've said, all three of you, about the life and what you've been saying this evening?
Thank you.
Yes, no, indeed. I appreciate that question, my brother, because, in so many ways, when we talk about philosophy, going to school with geometry, right? Descartes' Discourse on Method was a preface to 3 other books on geometry, on meteorics, dioptrics. You can go to school with poetry. It can go to school with biology. Life, when I hear what you're saying, my dear brother, about life, I'm thinking much more of the ways in which biologists talk about life and then wed it to humanistic studies. Now, Aristotle was a biologist. Plato, no. Very different temperament and sensibilities. Right? Aristotle never goes mad the way some figures in the symposium do. And he's got a soberness to him. I don't want to stereotype biologists. I'm sure there's some mad ones too. But it's a different way of looking at things. And so when you get to the 20th century, there's Bergson, there's Zimmel. You got folk who use precisely your language of life. When you read Nietzsche's uses and abuses of history, the major criteria, life enhancing and life undermining or life negating. What does he mean by that? Fascinating. We'd have to look very closely so that you are in good company in talking about this life in this regard. It's just that you can imagine, I started with Plato. I didn't talk too much about Aristotle, a little bit on the rhetorics and the poetics, but I was in a way swerving away from that rich tradition that you're calling us back to. And again, as somebody with a jazz sensibility, it's crucial for me to learn and listen from a variety of different voices that have different perspectives, that are very different from mine, that are alien to mine, that unsettle me, that unnerve me. That's the only way in which I can be a better jazz man in the life of the mind, a better force for good, fighting for poor and working people. And then in the end, a better Christian, because it's all about the humility. It's all about the love of neighbor, going back to Hebrew scripture of the Hesed being spread to orphan and widow and fatherless and motherless. And that's a particular tradition with all of its faults and all of its flaws still speaks so deeply to me.
The lady at the front, and then.
Good evening. I'm not quite sure how to phrase my question, and I want to just start with the fact that I've been aware of your work all my life, probably, but this is the first time I've seen you in person speaking. And I've been profoundly moved and excited by the message of your presence, so to speak. However, I have to ask a question. It's a question that's really begging in the room. In this space and in what you're evoking, I don't hear the female voice. I don't hear the women. I don't hear where you place the women in the catastrophe. And I'm really open to hearing, response from you. My own experience at this moment, I call myself a political entrepreneur. And I've been that all my life. My curiosity is always around human agency. And so all the questions around the magic, where does the power come from in the catastrophe, are always present. However, I find myself most of the time in the public space looking at the catastrophe of men, of the creators of the public space, of the breaking down of the public space. And I don't hear that much reference to the private space and how the private space, which has been historically governed, if you like, by women, might be an answer in the same way that relationship may be an answer for men, the relationship between the man and his wife, or within communities rather than in business. So I'm really open to your response to what I'm saying. My own partner is a jazz musician, and I've watched for 30 years his struggles with not being able to think about the future, caught in the catastrophe, leaning on jazz to give him these sparks of hope and possibility, however, not able to escape. He's a prisoner like you of hope, but not a person who can generate a future. So that's my question for you.
Yes, no, I appreciate that. It's fascinating because, this last lecture that I'm giving, I finally get a chance to delve into the blues and jazz tradition. And it's quite fascinating that the black literary tradition is probably the only modern tradition where the initial figures like Phyllis Wheatley, first black poet, in the New World, or we'll talk about Anne Plato's first black woman essayist, When you think of the first wave of blues vocalists at the highest level of excellence, the Ma Rainey's and the Bessie Smiths, they were hegemonic. It took a while for Muddy Waters and other geniuses to catch up with the women. And of course, when it comes to jazz vocalists, I can't think of a black male singer that comes anywhere near Ella Fitzgerald, Billie Holiday, Carmen McRae, Dinah Washington, and we haven't got to Sarah Vaughan yet. Right. Now, I'm not putting Johnny Hartman down, and Nat King Cole is fine, but we're talking about traditions in the modern world given the thickness of patriarchy in the history of the world, especially the West, where you have to dig very, very deep to get the woman's voices because the structures of domination tried to silence them so chronically and institutionally over time. Well, what was it about this tradition of black folk that when, in fact, artistically it emerges, you got all these women swinging, you know, in the physical sense, spiritual sense, artistic sense. Now, when it comes to the instruments, ooh, Mary Lou Williams, Jerry Allen on the pianos and so on. Hard to get the women on the saxophones and the trumpets. Patriarchy still operating, yes, indeed. And I don't know, which instrument does your loved one play?
He's a singer.
Oh, he sings.
I met him yesterday.
Yeah, absolutely. Oh, yes, he's serious, brother. I remember him, I do remember that brother. But he'd be the first to say that the women are at the highest levels of excellence, artistically as well as otherwise. But that doesn't speak to your direct question, which is how do we go about ensuring that when we invoke these figures of authority, they tend to be male when you're looking at the history, especially of the West and the kinds of research that various feminist scholars are more and more producing, where you get a number of these voices that have been suppressed, that have been silenced. I mean, the George Eliots and the Bronte sisters and so forth have been able to squeak through in many ways, but it's still predominantly men that, you want to say something about this? Sure, absolutely.
So I think it's important to distinguish between two extremely important intellectual projects that have emerged in the last 50 years. They serve the same ends, I think, but they are distinct and compatible projects. One of which is actually more dominant than the one Cornel has been executing in this lecture series, is the project of bringing the silenced to the attention of the world, okay? Mm-hmm. And Rachel, who asked the similar question on Monday, is one of the most prominent people who is engaging in that project. Also, in addition to studying silenced women, studying practices of silence and the mechanisms by which the silencing, the negative forms of silencing have occurred. All of that is extremely important. Now, Cornel, tell me if this interpretation of what you've done is correct as a distinct project from that, compatible with it, but distinct for this particular series. You said at the beginning that you were giving a genealogy. So what is a genealogy? Genealogy is historical inquiry into the forces that have shaped our taken for granted value categories. The genealogist, in this sense, is trying to be honest about the degree to which non-rational and low motives, non-rational forces and low motives have actually shaped our categories. So by engaging in an honest inquiry into that, beginning with an inherited category, the catastrophic, and then trying to determine the extent to which our intuitive view of this is shaped by forces that are non-rational and disturbing, then, hence the repeated references in the lectures to what can't be accepted in what so-and-so says. And that's Cornel distinguishing between those non-rational forces that have shaped our world and our categories, and our world through our categories, from rational sources of dissatisfaction with the world. If a policeman has his boot on my neck, I have good reason to want it off. And when I'm investigating history genealogically and I see someone's boot on someone's neck, I can attribute rational dissatisfaction with that social system to the person who's suffering. That means that going through the historical story, really taking seriously the differences, that ends up with a non-reductive form of genealogy, which grants that something's worth saving in these inherited ideals and these inherited concepts, but we have to do real historical work to sort it out. But where are you going to look when you do that work? At the texts and practices that are most strongly associated with power, that are most strongly associated with elite curricula, because that's where the most significant conceptual power is exercised. If you don't do both of these things, you're going to be in trouble. But I don't take you to be in any way trying to diss the other thing.
Oh, no. I mean, Saidiya Hartman's work and a host of others, very important in this regard, the way it lies text. In fact, she was a student of mine. And, she was a graduate student at Yale, and there's a whole wave of young scholars who have been doing this kind of thing. Of course, Farah Jasmine Griffin, who I'll be saying a bit more about her tomorrow, who's probably the finest reader of Toni Morrison. And then part of it is, well, where does Toni Morrison come from? She's not just as a black woman and a woman's voice and a genius and a giant and so forth, right? But those silencing places and mechanisms in domesticated, patriarchalized spaces, even as she then ends up writing MA thesis on Virginia Woolf and William Faulkner, teaches classes on Dante, and I was blessed to teach with her for 10 years at Princeton on a whole host of different figures, the Melville that she talks about playing in the dark, and the Harvard lectures that she gives, so that she has that kind of capaciousness, like any of the figures that I've talked about, but she's still wrestling with deeply white supremacist and male supremacist structures of domination that she has to be resilient against.
Mm-hmm. Can I just say a brief word to connect what you were asking about to Cornel's lectures, which is, you asked about relationality and the private. And I think the connection to what Cornel was talking about, and has been lecturing about, is love, right? So that it's not to essentialize, who are the purveyors of who are the virtuosos of love, or just say women, right? But the kind of the productive possibilities, generative possibilities of what may be found in the private sphere, as it were, but finds its expression powerfully publicly. And so, to recenter love, I think actually will get us away from, is it patriarchal, is it feminist, and so on, but that there are more expansive ways of understanding that.
One more question. Oh, gosh.
You want to take a few of them?
Can I just take the last three questions very quickly, and then so the gentleman in the middle, and the one behind him.
There's a woman here on the left.
And then the lady on the left.
Hi. So listened to that last lady's question, and it made me think of Nina Simone, the song "Ain't Got No, I've Got Life," and how this is a kind of it's an atheist anthem from a period when it would have been very difficult to it would have been a grapple with mainstream. But I feel that then allows that to belong to, say, the working class or any disenfranchised people. And then I think of Billie Holiday's "Strange Fruit," which I think is one of the most hauntingly beautiful songs there is, and on a very, very grotesque subject. And I wonder what the panel would think about if that song were performed today by a popular artist in one of these huge stadiums, whether that would really affect all the catastrophic things, the grotesque things that are happening in our contemporary world, or my personal feeling is that might be a little bit perverse. That's my question, basically.
And then I think it was, the gentleman behind, and then the lady on the left, and then we'll finish after that.
Right. Thank you very much. I should, I suppose, begin by saying that on Sunday I didn't know what philosophy was, and I'm very thankful for the fact I know a little bit more about it now. Obviously, this a tribute from the uttermost ignorance, but with the utmost gratitude to our wonderful Gifford lecturer. I notice a number of quotations from Karl Marx, and he could sometimes put things very well. But I'd like to first think of a common phrase in Ghana some years ago. He threw big English at me, which would be the way a Ghanaian would be talking, shall we say, about a colonial official. But it's extremely applicable today. There's an enormous amount of big English being thrown around, usually by administrators. And that kind of big English takes the place of studying the text. One of the innumerably beautiful things in the music with which we heard the Gifford lectures was because there was, as far as I was concerned, never a writer alluded to, but some illumination was not given about him, new understanding, new way of looking in, not a plea to agree with this or agree with that, but think and think and think. And this was marvelous. And he did it in a way which made us the wiser, enabled us to understand a little more philosophy. But we have to be careful about these things. I mean, we began this evening, didn't we, about a very interesting and thoughtful citation of Aeschylus, who would have been mostly from the Eumenides, but a touch of the libation pourers. But then we moved on to Euripides, and I couldn't work out whether the speaker was talking about the Electra, the Orestes, or the Bacchae. And whichever one you take, it gives an entirely different meaning to what the distinguished speaker was talking about. Orestes, for example, has everything to tell you about why the IRA became like they did, and other freedom movements which become appallingly inhuman. So I think, though, that we have, therefore, to make the most of this wonderful example we've been given about making our history constantly conscious of literature, culture, jazz, but we also have to remember history starting very, very much with the ordinary people, and I'm thinking here of people like Carter G. Woodson, who's founded the Journal of Negro History and founded it from scraps of folklore, reminiscences from people who had been born slaves, and this was in the early 20th century he was starting the work, contending with the fact that young white graduate students were told not to publish in the Journal of Negro History if they wanted to have careers. He was one of the people starting, thinking of Frederick Douglass. Oh, yes, we've mentioned him.
Sorry,
and he was the man who wrote his book to make people realize he was a human being. Now, that was his message, first of all. No, I'm not just an object here talking about a sad case study of slavery. I'm a human being. And this applies so much to some of the greatest possible work that history is first inarticulacy, for whatever reason, having to express itself and trying to. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. And the lady on the left. Thank you.
Thank you to the panel and to our chair. While I was listening, I was making notes on the things you were saying, and I wrote down a few things that I would invite you to reflect on. The different, so yeah, this kind of idea of a momentary pause from terror, dignity and dissonance, the quotidian miracle, and then the idea of truth-telling. And then for me, I keep thinking about, and I feel like everything that's happening cannot escape the moments of bleakness and catastrophe of the world as it is right now. And by that, I mean Palestine, and specifically, I mean Gaza. But I wanted initially to ask, then who are the philosophers in this really bleak moment, in this darkness, when you talked about the darkness of blues and grappling with that? Who is grappling with that? I honestly, most of the time, don't know what I should be doing with myself. I feel like there are people that do. I do look to Gaza to try and understand, because it seems like there's some sense. So I wanted to shift the question to ask for your reflections rather than who the philosophers are and where these notes and words are coming from that we should like be keening our ears towards. And then to ask maybe if you could reflect on Palestine, by which I mean in this moment right now, Gaza as a source. I would love to hear your thoughts on that.
Thank you, everyone, for your questions. We have very little time before I close, so I'm going to give everybody about a minute. Okay. So you can collect your thoughts.
We got it.
Who wants to go first?
You should go.
I think so.
Should I go first?
Yeah.
You can take whichever question, whichever order.
Oh, no, but all three of them are just so rich, though. My God, my God. I mean, genocide, we know, it has various cycles. It's not new in the history of the species. We see it now before our very eyes. It's the degree to which we have so many fellow human beings who are in denial about it, who come up with rationalizations of it, the thickness of the mendacity that hide the criminality. It reminds me of what was going on in the 1930s and when FDR sent out Henry Wallace to speak to the rabbis who had their own demonstrations because he thought somehow it was not important enough and he didn't have to worry about the votes. Well, it is not about voting. It's about truth. It's about justice. We've seen it over and over again, boss, and we go on and on and on. So we have to wait and see who the philosophic and poetic voices will emerge. But I think our task right now is to shatter all lies, shatter the silence, and try to ensure that the global awakening around it is such that it brings it to a stop. You've got to be able to stop it, and then you come to terms, if you can imagine, with the end of occupation and trying to make sure that Israeli brothers and sisters and Jewish brothers and sisters can live lives with Palestinian brothers and sisters with equality, with decency, with the kind of dignity across the board. People say, oh, that's impossible. They'll never be able to live together. Well, we got a lot of historical examples of people who've been at each other's throats for a long time, who come up with ways of living together, especially the younger generation where you have the Palestinian and the Jewish young people going to jail together, being crushed by police together in the name of something bigger than them. But our job right now is to stop the killing, stop the lies, stop the mendacity that generates the criminality and reveals U.S. policy, all the talk about human rights and international law as a lie in terms of practice. You're not serious about the execution. Well, what does that mean? That means that you bring power and pressure to bear to try to defund. That has a chance of stopping the killing and then not falling into any of the tribalistic, xenophobic traps of viewing this somehow as anti-Jewish, anti-Arab, anti-Muslim, anti-whatever. No, this is pro-humanity across the board. That's the moral and the spiritual dimension, it seems to me, at the moment. But we're in such a moment of emergency and overwhelming catastrophe. It's a matter of just making sure that our voices are heard. That's why I was blessed to spend the time that I did with the 2 rallies here in Edinburgh, tied to the encampments. How do we just keep our voices going? Now, when it comes to this international treasure right here, Brother Owen Dudley Edwards, good God Almighty, we can go on and on and on. He's just been kind enough to give me his many wonderful books that I can't wait to read. One of the great joys I've had at coming to Edinburgh is just meeting this brother. Really it is, that he brings a joy. He's got an intensity, an energy. He's got a wonderful creativity and humanity that hits you just in your hug before you even say a word. And then once he starts talking, of course, he got a whole lot to say because he's been reading for 70-some years, maybe more than that. He's 85 now, brother? Yes. 85 years young. It's unbelievable. It's unbelievable. And so in that regard, it's just part of the coming together of folk who have been shaped by so many similar traditions and legacies, and then being able to revel in each other's humanity in that regard. And the first question had to do with...
Strange fruit.
Oh, yes. Yes. The Billie Holiday, Baltimore City, the Jewish brother wrote that, you know, Maripol. So it was fascinating coming together at Cafe Society, 1939, when you got the genius of a Billie Holiday using the lyrics. He had been a member of the Communist Party. Well, the Communist Party actually, in history of the United States, integrated between black and white people before the churches did. Isn't that fascinating? Before the churches did, let alone the universities, you see. So whatever you think they're wrong on the different issues, when it came to that issue, Maripol and Billie Holiday, and she's not a member of the Communist Party, she just opened the creative lyrics with courage, talking about catastrophe. But you have to use the genres of the day that speak to especially the younger generation. Now, Macklemore just came out with his hip-hop song, right? How many in one day? What is it, Bay? 30 million? 35 million folk have heard that song about Gaza. Now here's this vanilla brother in the hip-hop genre. And he's got a critique of the black ones. Hey, y'all talking about you so big and bad, how come you didn't step forward? Me and Eminem, we know we're in a genre created by black creative geniuses, but it's the white two who step forward when it comes to these issues. There will be more. J. Cole and the others are coming. Erykah Badu is coming. Rhapsody's going to be doing it. Yes, black folk are going to do it. But at this particular moment, that's not at the level of Strange Fruit artistically. No, the music's been dumbed down in the last 50 years. But it still has something to say, and it takes courage of a Macklemore to do that. It's very much so. He's kind enough to have me in there jumping over the fence at Columbia University. I said he didn't have to do that, and I don't even know him, but it's nice to be in there. How come? I want to be a small part of the wave that puts the focus on our precious Palestinian brothers and sisters who will not be crushed even given genocidal attack. The resilience is still there. The fight back is still there, right? So that's one example of a Strange Fruit-like response to the barbarism of that day, which is the lynching of black people, and the U.S. Congress couldn't even pass a bill, even under FDR's leadership, because of the ties of the Southern elites in the Democratic Party that our brother Fred Martin has written about magisteriously, given his own training at Harvard and as a historian as well as a political writer for various politicians in a progressive manner, you see. So in that sense, you know, I hope that we don't leave discouraged. That's the crucial thing. We need all the courage, vision, resilience we can get at one of the grimmest moments in the history of the species. We haven't talked about ecological catastrophe yet, which could end the whole thing.
Thank you very much.
I'll try to be brief. I'll just pick up on the phrase moments of interruption from the last question. Part of what I was trying to do in my opening remarks was to draw you out on the object of hope and the grounds for hope. So if the only source of illumination is an interruption from above, then the possibility of transfiguring ordinary reality and seeing enough good in it to be transfigured gets eliminated. The other question has to do with whether more than a moment of interruption can be hoped for and must be hoped for in order to respect the actual yearning we all feel to have our relationship set right, not merely for the terror to be interrupted momentarily, but for us to find a way to live with one another that we can deal with, cope with, survive in, the hope that Paul D. was expressing.
Yes, 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 yes. Indeed, indeed.
To that last question, I mean, the candor in which you spoke of not knowing what to do. You know, and I think this is really one of these moments where we have to honor that confusion, and we have to honor that sense of impotence, even if we have examples that things have been rendered differently. Because, you know, in the midst of it, in the thick of it, heartbreak doesn't even begin to capture what's happening. Not just for the people in Gaza, but just to witness that. And, you know, the genocides, I mean, you know, we haven't talked about Sudan and all these places where just the impossible inhumanity that we're witnessing. And it is very difficult not to revert to cynicism. It is very difficult to say, well, if not this, then what is going to turn our hearts to this suffering? And so I just want to take this moment to say, like, yeah, honor your confusion, honor the sense that, you know, it can feel hopeless, and then try to invest best we can in those glimpses of hope, you know, that growing edge, knowing that it may not be permanent, but it may be the best we can do for the moment. For the moment.
Thank you, gentlemen. Ladies and gentlemen, this evening is going to draw to an end very soon. And before I say thank you to Dr. West and Jeffrey Stout and Dr. David Kim, I'd like to first of all remind you that the final lecture, Gifford Lecture, is tomorrow in the Informatics Forum. I think it's starting about 5:30. I just want to thank them for taking time out of their schedule, treating us to this wonderful conversation, and ending on a note of hope. I'm just going to say very briefly a few words that I was thinking of when I was reflecting on the lectures. I did not know much about John Coltrane till I started thinking about these lectures. And I realized that for him, a musician was a message giver. Making music was an endeavor tied to a larger, greater good. And he said, I humbly ask to be given the means and privileges to make others happy through music. And he wrote in a letter in 1966, less than a year before his death, I know that there are bad forces, forces that bring suffering to others and misery to the world. I want to be the opposite force. I want to be the force which is truly for good. And I thought about a poem by a British Nigerian poet, Ben Okri. And I just want to end on that because I think in a way what has been running through the lectures and through the conversation today is not that hope is easy, but actually whether it's at times of catastrophe or times in the banality of ordinary life that we need to keep hope alive is also a struggle. And he writes, but we live in times that have lost this tough art of dreaming. Can we still seek the lost angels of our better natures? Can we still wish and will for poverty's death and a newer way to undo war and find peace in the labyrinth of the Middle East and prosperity in Africa as a true way to end the feared tide of immigration? We dream of a new politics that will renew the world under their weary, suspicious gaze. There's always a new way, a better way that's not been tried before. Thank you, gentlemen, for showing us glimmers of a new way.